Welcome to Worth Your Time with your hosts from the nationally syndicated Bob and Tom Show, Kristi Lee, and the president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, Dr. Rob Shumaker. Our mission to inform, entertain, and educate with guests from all aspects of life. We guarantee there isn't another podcast that features two hosts with such different backgrounds and discussions with remarkable people doing exceptional things. So let's get started. Here are your hosts, Kristi Lee and Dr. Rob Shumaker.
Well, here we are again, Dr. Rob. It's Worth Your Time with Dr. Rob Shumaker and myself, Kristi Lee. And our guest today is someone that you turned me on to, so to speak. I have no idea about snakes. And we're going to talk snakes. Like, I know what they are.
Yeah,
I know
course.
they slither around. And I know a lot of people have very high emotions one way or another about them. But today I get to learn as much as our listeners.
Oh, wow, me too. This is a phenomenal book, a new book, and the title is simple. It's called Slither. You already used it when you said slithering around.
Yeah, I did,
Perfect.
and that was subconsciously.
So, a book called Slither. I'll be honest, I learned of this book from a Wall Street Journal review, a great review, and what caught my attention was the title of the review was Sympathy for Serpents. And I love the idea of any writer who has sympathy for serpents. And today we have Stephen S. Hall, and he said we can call him Steve.
Yeah, because we're good friends now.
We're friends.
Well, you're a snake guy. You got to come out and admit this.
Yeah,
yes.
I really am, and we'll get to it. I think I kind of get characterized in the book, not me personally. No. I mean, people who are really into snakes, it's not always viewed favorably.
Really?
So, well, yeah, we'll talk about it.
Okay, we'll talk about it.
But here's the thing. I really hope, even if someone has a really negative reaction to the idea of snakes or really, really dislike snakes, please listen. Please don't turn this off just because you don't like snakes. Because I think, honestly, and I'll be interested in asking Steve in a minute, I don't think the book is really about snakes. I mean, of course, snakes are an important part of the book, but it's really about people and snakes and our attitudes about snakes, our thoughts about snakes. There's some great snake biology in this, but trust me, it's not a textbook. This is nothing you'd find in a herpetology course. This is a phenomenal book about people, people's attitudes, people's thoughts about snakes, and it's a refreshing volume. First of all, easy to read, lyrically written, and it's about snakes.
Well, let's talk to the author. I'm excited.
Steve, welcome to Worth Your Time.
Thank you much for having me.
How did I do? Did I characterize it okay?
Yeah, I think that idea that it's about people as well as the animal is really important, because one of the motivations for me was I knew people don't like snakes, and I thought it was an interesting challenge to sort of, unpack what's behind the fear to the extent you can do that. And also try to change people's minds. And simply by talking about how incredible these creatures are. And I guess one of the things that surprised me in the research for the book is that, and I talk about this, historically, we've all got hung up on the sort of external physical characteristics of the snake, like how long they are, which snake is the most venomous, how much they weigh, that sort of stuff, how big a meal they can eat, all of which are interesting and important. But there's been scientific research in the last 10 or 15 years that has revealed how extraordinary these creatures are at all sorts of levels. Their genetic nimbleness, if you will, in terms of how they evolve venom and variations in venom, their metabolism, the way they move, their sexual antagonism between male and female snakes. A lot of this stuff was simply not known even 20 years ago. And it was a revelation to me, and I hope it would be a revelation to readers just to encounter some of this information and maybe have a little rethink about what a lot of people regard as a primitive and repulsive creature, when in fact they mostly like to keep to themselves, and they can teach us a lot of interesting things if we pay them some respect and interest.
So you're demystifying the snake. I like this. And have you always been a snake guy? When did this start for you?
I've never viewed myself as like a herper or a snake guy per se, but like many young boys, mostly of my generation, I spent a lot of time outside and turning over rocks and catching turtles and frogs and snakes occasionally, and I always thought they were really interesting creatures. I moved on to other things after that, but there's always been a fascination because they're so different. I think that's the other thing that people maybe find a little bit frightening. They're like the animal kingdom's main other, or one of the big others of the animal kingdom. There's something intrinsically different about them. And I think we're always a little bit frightened by differences. But
Sure.
I attempt to overcome that just by talking about, the amazing things that they can do.
So, Steve, I probably did you a disservice. I should have said at the very beginning, you are an award-winning many awards for your work. You are not a herpetologist, you're not a scientist, but you are an incredible writer. And I love how you are characterized, that you look at the intersection of science and society. And you've done that with a whole variety of topics, books, essays, articles, and so on. So I encourage anybody to look you up. I mean, wow, you're going to have a lot of great stuff to read if you start picking up your volumes. But I love that you turned your attention to snakes. So you write on such a variety of topics. How did you pick snakes?
Well, again, there's kind of this long-standing in and out interest with snakes, or just always being interested in seeing them at zoos and so on and so forth. The other piece of it was, to be honest with you, the agent had suggested, why don't you do a book about an animal? And I said, I'll only do a book about an animal if it's an animal that a lot of people don't like. And the reason I said that was for several reasons. One, I thought it'd be a more interesting challenge to try to confront and encounter that sense of revulsion or disgust, and try to get people to maybe think a little bit differently about a creature that they loathe and detest. And the other piece of it is a larger kind of conservation argument. And I thought about this in terms of the fundraising pitches you get from environmental organizations. You never see a snake on the animals that they depict. There's certain animals that sort of appeal
Totally
to our
true.
humanity, and we like them for one reason or another. They're either cuddly or they're majestic, and snakes don't fill that bill. They're never asked to do fundraising pitches for organizations. And I thought, how can you have conservation when ecologies are these very complex webs of interactions between environment and the biota living in it, and pick and choose which animals are worth saving and protecting and which aren't. So I think it's really important if you're going to save one animal, you have to save all of them, in a sense that we have to. Preservation and ecological sensitivity, I think, has to be very holistic. And so I wanted to sort of make the argument that we need to care for the creatures, even the ones that we don't like, especially because it's all in the service of preserving the larger holistic environment.
Which is right up our wheelhouse.
Yeah, it's
That's
fantastic.
exactly
It's
the
fantastic.
mission of the zoo. And,
Yeah. So I think it's in a very good way, in a very welcoming way, and I think in a very unique way that is apparent in this book from page 1. And that's part of what drew me to it. I really, couldn't finish this book fast enough. It was just terrific. And I will share. Kristi's right. I'm a huge snake fan. I've loved snakes my whole life. I don't know why. Early on,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why. I suspect it's because no one told me I shouldn't. A lot. Well, no, a lot.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, the first thing they hear is, "Oh, stay away from that. It's horrible." Whatever.
Oh, that's poisonous. Don't touch that.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
Don't
whatever.
touch it.
Yeah.
But I never heard that. So, I just think they're incredible, and more to come on that. But I have a bias, and I think you touch on it, Steve, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, because I made an assumption about the book. I don't know if it's true. And I made an assumption about you. I don't know if it's true. So I'm a biologist. I don't have any, not a psychologist, therapist, anything like that. But I've helped many, many, many people get over their fear of snakes. And some it's quick, some it takes weeks, it doesn't matter. But my bias is that the very best way to get over your fear of snakes is to understand them. I mean, I think a lot of people take that position that, oh no, it has to be emotion. You have to love it. You have to. I don't think so. And now that's not for everybody, but I think for a lot of people, if you can replace that irrational stuff you have in your mind that creates a fear of snakes with the real information, which is frankly remarkable, it's amazing how transformative that could be. Now, I made an assumption that you have that same bias to you, but I don't know if you do.
Well, I think, this idea of understanding, the more you know about a creature, I think the more you appreciate them. You appreciate their unique biology, the unique things they can do. And certainly in the case of snakes, I felt like the more people learn about, understand, and hopefully marvel at the various things that we've learned, invisible things that we never even saw until we had the tools to actually see them, that they would have a new understanding and consequently a new appreciation of these animals. And I think that's, I think knowledge overcomes, not all the time, but often overcomes either fear, ignorance, that sort of thing. So it's helpful to just lay out some of the things that have been discovered and wow people a little bit by some of the qualities of these animals.
Wow me. I want to know what one of these things would be.
There's so many. One of the things I talk about, for example, is some research that was done roughly in the last 10 or 15 years on the pit organ of pit vipers. So this is an organ which senses infrared radiation. So it's a thermal detector. And they didn't know really the molecular mechanism of how this actually works. So a group of scientists at a laboratory the University of California, San Francisco, literally dissected the heads of rattlesnakes from Texas. They brought them back to California. They molecularly dissected the pit organ, and they discovered that there is a molecule that kind of receives chemical signals or thermal signals, depending on what the signal is, in the pit organ of these snakes that is remarkably sensitive to thermal temperature changes. And the really remarkable thing is that there's been a huge amount of work on other organisms, including humans, in terms of these various chemical receptors. And this one turned out to be an ortholog, very similar to the same receptor that humans have for wasabi mustard.
Oh.
So it's a receptor that picks up things that are irritating or heat related. And we use it for one thing, for sushi, and they use it for detecting potential prey in the environment. But the chemical sensitivity of snakes beyond just the pit organ it's really remarkable. And one of the anecdotes I talk about in the book, there's a very well-known herpetologist who I'm sure Rob knows, named Harry Green,
Yes.
who in his own memoir related an episode where he was looking for a rattlesnake. They were tracking them. They had radio chips in them. And his transmitter was telling him it was right in front of him, but he couldn't find it. And he was looking under this tree and he's getting down on his hands and knees and crawling under it. And he's not finding it anywhere where he's getting the signal. And then he just sort of sits up, and then out of the corner of his eye, he realizes this rattlesnake is, like literally a few inches away from his head, but didn't bite and didn't strike. And, he slowly eased out of the situation. And he said that this could have been, a horrible snake bite, obviously. Well, there was a woman 50, 60 years earlier named Grace Olive Wiley, who was a librarian in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but kept hundreds of snakes and actually was among, if not the first, to basically breed rattlesnakes in captivity in the United States. She had this theory that if she threw clothes of hers that she had worn that carried her scent into the cages of newly arrived, very venomous snakes like cobras and rattlesnakes, that they would habituate chemically to her scent and consequently would not feel threatened by her. And if you go through the literature, you will see pictures of her nuzzling cobras and wrapping rattlesnakes around her neck, wearing it like a bracelet, holding it up to her, her mother, children, and everybody thought she was nuts, frankly. She was actually the curator of reptiles at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago for a couple of years, but she had this habit of kind of letting the venomous snakes circulate freely in the reptile house, and she ultimately was let go. But I was surprised because I asked some people who were kind of experts in chemical detection in snakes, and they said, that's not as crazy an idea as it sounds like. And Harry Green I asked about, and he said, if you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said, that's crazy. But knowing now what I know, I think it's actually possible. So this idea that perhaps this is the snake he was tracking was one that he had handled multiple times. They trapped it or captured. It's called female 21. They had operated on it multiple times to insert these transmitters, and he feels like she did not recognize him as a threat and therefore didn't strike him as a defensive strike. So this is still on the level of sort of speculation about whether this system is true. But if you talk to people who study chemosensation in snakes, they don't rule it out as a possibility, which is really remarkable. It suggests that they actually might recognize individual humans on the basis of the chemical trace or scent that they leave, signature, if you will.
The faith that woman had to have had.
Yeah.
My goodness gracious. I can't.
That's it. You're speechless.
I mean, well, think about that. I mean, that could have gone horribly wrong.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, this is one of the things that's great.
Well, ultimately, it did.
Oh. Honestly, Steve, I was going to ask that, but I was afraid to.
Yeah, but interestingly, it was with a snake that had not been habituated in the same way. It was a newly arrived cobra, and it had not been sort of trained to her scent, and it bit her and she died. But that was 15, 20 years after she had been at the Brookfield Zoo.
She died doing what she loved. Isn't that what they say?
Yeah. But I'll tell you that the story you just told, Steve, this is one of the things that's fantastic about this book that was so surprising to me, because there's so much new information and new research characterized in this book. That's one of the things that makes this a great read.
I can't wait.
Even if you're extremely experienced with snakes or herpetology or reptiles, you're still going to like this, because there's stuff I guarantee hasn't come across your desk yet. Hey, Steve, I want to ask you a question. I'm not trying to stump you here. I have it in front of me. You use a great word that was new to me. It's called ardency. Can you talk about that in relation to snakes, or can I read the quote to you? What do you prefer?
Sure, you can read the quote and I can comment after it.
Oh, it's such a great quote. Ardency is a quaint, old-fashioned 19th century noun you rarely hear these days. But as soon as I saw the word, I thought back to the Saturday morning field trip. It was exactly the right word to describe that snake. Ardency means being alive in some hot-wired, zealous, visibly fervent way. It means thrashing and writhing and darting and slithering and bursting with life. It means eluding and camouflaging and ambushing and fending off with a vital life force. What a phenomenal quote. And that's the way this book is written.
Man.
What drew
and
you
I remember
to
that was 50 years ago, and more than 50 years ago, and I still remember the feel of that snake trying to get out of my hands. And it was just a feeling that I don't know, once you experience it, it changes your sort of thinking about the animal, but also the natural world. It's just that life force is struggling in your hand. It's a little different that, as I mentioned in the book, I've caught fish and turtles and frogs and all sorts of things. It was different. It just had this kind of ardency to it, if you will. Just this desire to get away, and you could feel it's a very slender snake, but you could feel this muscular power and this desire to escape. It was just it left a lifelong impression, really.
So you have a lot that you discuss about how people develop their attitudes towards snakes. And I think it's such an important topic. What did you come away with in terms of how people develop? I mean, come on, it started with the Bible. Even before the Bible, the snakes have it stacked against them. But I wonder if you can kind of give some description of what it is that has caused people to have such a terrible time with snakes?
I think the answer to that question is both cultural and neuroscience. And if you'll, Cliff's Note version of a really interesting theory on the neuroscience side, and you're probably familiar with this, scientist in California named Lynn Isbell has this theory called the snake detection theory. And it's pretty well reasoned and very well researched. People are very familiar with it, although it was originally advanced only, I think, 2009. The idea is that very early in evolutionary time, and we're talking tens of millions of years ago with the early evolution of mammals, one of their main predators were constricting snakes. So we're talking roughly maybe 80 to 100 million years ago. And consequently, there was an evolutionary advantage to detect snakes very quickly. And her argument is because of this selective pressure, as evolutionary scientists call it, the brains of early mammals developed a dual pathway to the visual center of the brain from the eyes, one of which is almost subconscious and instantaneous, and the second, which is pretty quick, but not quite as quick, that went into the cognitive center of the brain. And the first one, which is instantaneous, says, oh, there's something there that may be dangerous. And then the cognitive part of it is, oh, that's a snake and I should back off. This is early mammals. Early mammals then lead to primates. Primates begin to refine this visual system with the advent of venomous snakes. The ante and the stakes become even greater because the mortal danger of a venomous snake to a primate is obviously very great. Long and the short of the theory, and I'm really condensing it here and distilling it, but basically her idea is that humans inherited both this quick and slower detection system. So it's almost a built-in, some psychologists have called it a fear module. Others prefer to call it just a detection module. But you can make the argument that the human brain has, as part of its visual apparatus, the ability to detect snakes very quickly as a selective event early in evolutionary history to avoid getting bitten. And then you have this slower, more cognitive piece of this pathway. Again, not that much slower, but interestingly, it's within the sort of time frame of how long it takes for a venomous snake to strike. This affected the development of the human visual system. And Isbell makes the argument that the reason that the human vision is as acute as it is and has the ability to read fine print in, for example, books, derives ultimately from this evolutionary path that began perhaps 90, 80, 100 million years ago. But what it suggests is that what's really interesting about it is, of course, there's this automatic, almost subconscious detection of snakes. But as soon as you hit the cognitive part of the brain, that's the part that sort of goes, well, maybe that's a snake that's not dangerous, or maybe I don't need to be afraid of it. And the cognitive part of the brain is the part of the brain that learns. And consequently, if you're taught to be afraid of snakes, then that's your sort of mindset. And if you're taught not to be afraid of snakes, and I think probably something that you kind of referred to a little bit earlier, but when people actually handle snakes and they see that they're not harmless, they're not slimy, they're actually very curious and easy to handle, that works on the sort of cultural and cognitive part of our reaction to them. Now, the other cultural piece of this is that prior to the Bible, there were a number of cultures that celebrated the snake, revered the snake. It was part of the origin myths of cultures in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Greece, in Mesoamerica. Doesn't always mean that they loved snakes, but they respected and revered them. They were, in some cultures, seen as messengers between humans and nature. They were seen as symbols of the unpredictability of life and therefore or deserved respect simply because humans could not predict everything and the uncontrollability of fate the snake seemed to represent. In ancient Greece, and this was kind of mind-blowing because I knew none of this stuff before, there was a very early association going back to, say, the 5th, 6th century BC of snakes with health. And there was a cult that arose in antiquity It was the cult of Asclepius, and Asclepius was a hero and god who was renowned as a healer even before Hippocrates. And this cult grew and spread throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the ancient world, North Africa, as far north as Germany, Asia Minor, all over, hundreds and hundreds of sanctuaries where the snake was actually often a part of the healing process, which is why when you see a medical facility, a pharmacy, you see the snake twining around the staff. The staff was Asclepius's walking stick, and the snake was, according to mythological sources, whispered the secrets of healing to Asclepius originally, and that was the origin of the myth. And then in each one of these sanctuaries, or in many of them, a sacred snake was brought to sort of consecrate and just certify, if you will, the site as a healing center. And it's hard to exaggerate how majestic some of these sanctuaries were. They're among the most elaborate institutions that have survived from the ancient world. There were gymnasiums, there were dormitories, there were altars, there were spas, there were sort of thermal baths. In Epidaurus, which was kind of the mothership in Greece of the cult of Asclepius, there's a huge Greek theater that's still used today for plays. In other words, it was a holistic notion of health. And it was also one of the very first instances where people went to a place to be cured. So it was kind of the proto-hospital, if you will. Mm-hmm. And the snake was an integral part of this whole kind of health system, if you will.
Did they actually use the venom of the snake, or was it just a symbol of...
It was a symbol. Asclepius was believed to take the form of a snake in the dreams of people. It was called the temple sleep, and they would sleep in these dormitories, and they would have dreams, and the dreams sometimes would have this coming to them in the form of a snake, and then suggesting how to cure their illness. Then there are all these votive tablets, like, blurbs on the back of books now saying, I had this and Asclepius came and my illness was cured in a number of these temples.
And I loved that the point you made that snakes were encouraged to just free range in these places.
Yeah. There's a certain amount, you can never, with archaeology and ancient cultures, there's always a fair amount of speculation going on. But there has been academic speculation that not only were harmless snakes, allowed to circulate freely in this dormitory at night when people were having the temple sleep, but they may have taken some form of psychedelic ahead of time to sort of prepare them for the ability to have these dreams.
Interesting.
Well,
fascinating.
The twists and turns.
Yes, and we're just tapping it.
I know it. So we're talking to Stephen S. Hall. Phenomenal new book called Slither.
Yes,
which talks about snakes, but I also think snakes and people on this great theme of Steve's career, which is the intersection of science and society. But believe it or not, we're at a spot where we ought to take a break.
Yes, we should take a break real
and
quick.
We'll
come back with part 2.
We will come back with part 2. So we're going to hold it here and then come back and start talking about the Bible.
You've been listening to Worth Your Time with Dr. Rob Shumaker and Kristi Lee. If you like what you hear, please give a review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best compliment. Thanks to our producers, Chris Spangle of Leaders and Legends, LLC. You can reach him at leadersandlegends.net. Also, thanks to Sophie Ritz. I'm Christopher Geisen. Thanks for joining us.